The villagers gathered around, their eyes filled with scorn as they watched her kneel in the mud. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised, and her trembling hands gripped the hem of her dress. Laughter rang through the air, sharp, cruel, and endless. "Look at her! She thought she could sit with us? She smells like the streets." No one offered a hand. No one spoke for her, except for him. A deep voice cut through the laughter like thunder. "That's enough." The crowd fell silent. She lifted her gaze and saw him, his hands covered in grease, his clothes old but clean. His dark eyes burned with quiet fury. That was the day everything changed. Elena sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the glittering gold jewelry laid out before her. Each piece was a reminder of the life she was about to leave behind. The mansion, the wealth, the endless luxury. None of it had ever brought her happiness. "You are making a mistake." Her mother's voice was sharp, full of frustration. "You have everything, yet you want to throw it away for a foolish dream." Elena clenched her fists. "I don't want to marry someone just because he's rich. I want to find real love." Her father sighed deeply. "No one will love you the way you think, Elena. You are safe here." "Safe?" she scoffed. "I've never felt more trapped." Her parents exchanged a helpless glance. This wasn't the first time she had argued about this, but tonight, she had made up her mind. The next day, she packed a small bag. She left behind her silk dresses and expensive shoes, choosing instead a few worn-out clothes. She smeared dirt on her face, cut her long, flowing hair, and slipped out of the mansion under the cover of darkness. She didn't know exactly where she was going. All she knew was that she would rather struggle than live a lie. The town of Lagos was alive with the scent of roasted corn, fried plantains, and the distant sound of talking drums. Elena walked through the streets, her stomach twisting with hunger. She had spent the last of her money on transport, and now she had nowhere to sleep. People glanced at her but quickly looked away. To them, she was just another beggar, another homeless girl struggling to survive. She found a small corner near a marketplace and sat down, her body aching. As night fell, the cold wrapped around her like a cruel embrace. She hugged herself tightly, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. The next morning, she wandered onto a college campus. She had always wanted to experience normal life, and here was her chance. She used the little money she had saved to enroll, but it wasn't long before people noticed her. Her clothes were old, her shoes had holes, her books were secondhand, and the whispers began. "Who is she? Why does she look so dirty? She doesn't belong here." Elena kept her head down, pretending not to hear them, but deep inside, the words cut her like a knife. At first, the insults were small. A sneer here, a chuckle there. But as days passed, it became worse. Someone threw water at her books. Another student knocked her food tray from her hands. Girls laughed at her clothes, whispering cruel things behind her back. One afternoon, as she walked through the courtyard, a group of girls blocked her path. "Look at this one," a tall girl with gold earrings sneered. "Do you think you belong here?" Elena swallowed hard. "Please just let me go." "Or what?" another girl taunted. Before she could react, someone shoved her. She stumbled, falling onto the ground. Laughter erupted around her. Pain flared in her hands and knees, but the pain in her heart was worse. And then, "That's enough." The laughter stopped. Elena looked up and saw him. He wasn't dressed in fine clothes. His hands were covered in grease, his face slightly sweaty from hard work. But his eyes held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. "Leave her alone," he said again, his voice firm. The girls scoffed but backed away, muttering under their breaths. Elena's lips trembled as she tried to stand. A strong hand reached out to her. She hesitated for a moment before taking it. That was the moment everything changed. Elena wiped her face quickly, trying to hide her tears, but the stranger had already seen them. "You okay?" His voice was deep but gentle. She nodded, though her body was still trembling from the humiliation. "I'm James," he said, offering a small smile. His fingers were rough, calloused from hard labor, but his grip was steady and warm. "I'm Elena," she whispered. James glanced at the girls who had bullied her. They were still watching, whispering, smirking. His jaw tightened. "Come," he said, motioning for her to follow him. Elena hesitated. No one had ever stood up for her before. Was this another trick? Another way to humiliate her? But something in his eyes told her otherwise. She followed. James led her through the streets, past the noisy vendors selling roasted corn and plantains, past the children playing with sticks and stones. He finally stopped at a small shop, the scent of engine oil and rusted metal filling the air. "This is where I work," he said. Elena looked around. It was a mechanic shop, small and messy, with cars in different states of repair. Men in dirty overalls worked tirelessly, their hands covered in grease. "You're a mechanic?" she asked. James grinned. "Best in town." She couldn't help but smile a little. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back and returned with a bottle of water and a small towel. "Clean yourself up." Elena hesitated but took it. The water was cold and refreshing. She wiped her face, washing away the dirt and dried tears. For the first time in a long while, someone had shown her kindness, and it made her want to cry even more. James didn't ask her any questions. He didn't ask why she looked so tired, why her clothes were torn, or why she had no one to defend her. Instead, he took her to a small food stall near the market. "Sit," he said. Elena sat on the wooden bench, her stomach twisting. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. James ordered a plate of rice and beans, with a side of fried plantains. When the food arrived, the smell made her dizzy. "Eat," he said. Elena hesitated. No one had ever done this for her before. "Are you sure?" she asked. James chuckled. "What kind of question is that? Of course I'm sure. Eat." She picked up a spoon and took a small bite. The flavors exploded in her mouth, warm, spicy, comforting. She swallowed quickly and took another bite, then another. Before she knew it, the plate was empty. James smiled. "You eat like someone who hasn't eaten in weeks." Elena wiped her mouth, embarrassed. I just... Thank you." James leaned back, watching her. "You don't have to tell me your story, Elena. But I can see you've been through a lot." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't just a poor girl, that she had left behind a life of luxury to find something real. But she was afraid. Would he still be kind to her if he knew? She looked away. "I don't have much," she finally said. "I just want to be happy." James nodded. "Happiness is hard to find, but it's easier when you're not alone." Elena's heart ached at his words. For the first time since she left home, she felt like she had found a friend. The next day, the entire college was talking about it. "Did you see her eating with that mechanic? She's so shameless. First, she dresses like a beggar, and now she's dating a grease monkey? I heard she doesn't even have a home." Elena ignored the whispers, but they followed her everywhere. The girls who bullied her had spread rumors, ugly, cruel stories about her. Some laughed, others sneered. By afternoon, someone had written on her locker with chalk, "Beggar girl." Her throat tightened as she stared at the words. James saw it too. He was standing a few feet away, his fists clenched. Elena forced herself to smile. "It's okay," she whispered. But James shook his head. "No, it's not." She didn't know what he was going to do, but when he turned and walked away, something told her that the whispers were far from over. Something told her that James wasn't the type to stay silent. James stormed through the college courtyard, his anger barely contained. He wasn't a violent man, but seeing the cruel words written on Elena's locker, hearing the whispers, and watching her pretend it didn't hurt, it was too much. He found the group of girls laughing near the cafeteria. "Which one of you did it?" His voice was low, controlled. The girls stopped laughing. One of them, a tall girl with braided hair and expensive jewelry, crossed her arms. "What are you talking about, mechanic boy?" James took a deep breath, trying to control his temper. "You know what I'm talking about. The writing on Elena's locker, the rumors, the bullying." The girl scoffed. "So what? It's not our fault she looks like a street rat." The others laughed. James clenched his jaw. "If you have a problem with her, come to me. Leave her alone." The girl smirked. "Oh, how sweet. The beggar girl has a knight in shining overalls." More laughter. James stepped closer, his eyes burning. "Say what you want about me, but if you ever touch her again, you'll regret it." The smirk faded. There was something in James's voice that made the air tense. The girls muttered amongst themselves before walking away. James watched them go, his fists still clenched. He didn't care what they thought of him, but he would never let them hurt Elena again. Elena sat on a wooden bench under a mango tree, her hands trembling. She had seen James confront the girls. She had heard his voice, firm and protective. No one had ever stood up for her before. Her mind drifted back to her old life, to the lavish parties, the expensive gifts, the fake smiles. No one had ever fought for her, not even her parents. They had expected her to marry a rich man, to live in a golden cage. She had run away to find love, but all she had found was pain. Tears welled up in her eyes. She thought of James, the way he had looked at her when she was at her lowest, the way he had offered her food, a kind word, a safe place. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found something real. Later that evening, as Elena walked toward the mechanic shop to see James, a black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a man in a crisp suit. He was tall, with sharp eyes that held no kindness. "Elena," he said smoothly. She froze. "How do you know my name?" The man smiled. "Your parents sent me." Her heart stopped. "They want you to come home," he continued. "They said you've had your fun, but it's time to stop this nonsense." Elena's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not going back." The man chuckled. "You think you belong here? With these people?" His eyes flickered toward the mechanic shop. "With a grease-covered nobody?" Elena's stomach twisted. The man leaned in closer. "Come back, and everything will be forgiven. You'll have your old life back. Money, comfort, security." Elena took a deep breath. She thought about the mansion, the silk sheets, the servants at her beck and call. Then she thought about James. She squared her shoulders. "Tell my parents I'm not coming back." The man's smile faded. "You'll regret this." The car drove away, leaving Elena standing in the street, her heart pounding. She had made her choice, but deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. James stared at the crumpled bills in his hands. It was all he had left, money he had been saving for months, hoping to fix the leaking roof of the tiny shop he worked in. But when Elena told him she had no money left for her college fees, he didn't hesitate. She had been quiet that evening, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her dress as they sat under their usual tree. "James," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't pay my tuition. I'll have to drop out." James's heart clenched. He knew how much education meant to her, how hard she had worked. He looked at her tired eyes, the weight of the world pressing on her fragile shoulders. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and placed the money in her hands. "James, no." Elena's voice broke. He smiled softly. "Take it. You need this more than I do." Tears welled in her eyes. "But what about you? You've been saving for months." "I'll be fine, Elena." He cupped her hands in his. "I don't have much, but what I have, it's yours." She let out a sob, holding the money to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, her tears falling onto his hands. James wiped them away. "I'll do anything for you." She looked at him then, truly looked at him. And in that moment, she knew. James was the kind of love she had been searching for. The next day, Elena returned to college. She should have been happy, but the whispers started again the moment she walked through the gates. Look at her, still wearing the same dress. She probably begged for money again. Elena clenched her books tighter, forcing herself to ignore them. But it got worse when she reached the courtyard. A group of girls stood in a circle, their laughter sharp like knives. Elena, one of them called. Tell us, did you find another rich man to pay your fees? The others laughed cruelly. Elena's hands trembled. Leave me alone. Or what? Another girl sneered. You're just a poor orphan pretending you belong here. Elena opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a strong hand slid into hers. James. His presence was like a shield around her. He looked at the girls, his voice calm but firm. Mock her all you want, he said, but at least she's strong enough to stand on her own. Can any of you say the same? The laughter died instantly. The girls scoffed but didn't say another word as James pulled Elena away. They walked in silence until they reached the mechanic shop where he worked. Then, finally, Elena broke down. James caught her before she could fall, wrapping his arms around her. Shh, he whispered, stroking her hair. They don't matter. None of them do. Elena clung to him, her body shaking. I hate this, James. I hate being laughed at. James pulled back slightly, cupping her face. Then let them laugh, Elena. Let them. Because at the end of the day, I'll still be here, and I'll always love you. Elena's breath caught. He had never said it before. She searched his face, seeing nothing but truth in his eyes. I love you too, she whispered. And for the first time, despite all the pain, she felt truly safe. A few days later, Elena was returning from the market when she noticed a man standing by her doorstep. He was tall, dressed in a suit, and looked completely out of place in their poor neighborhood. Her stomach twisted. Miss Elena? His voice was formal, but there was a softness in his eyes. Who are you? She asked cautiously. He took a deep breath. I was sent by your parents. Your father. He's very sick. Elena's heart stopped. She hadn't thought about home in months. She had pushed it away, burying it under the struggles of survival. Your mother wanted you to know, the man continued. He keeps asking for you. Elena gripped the doorframe. She should have felt anger. She should have told the man to leave. But all she felt was a deep, aching sadness. Her voice was barely a whisper. I can't go back. Not yet. The man sighed. I understand. He handed her a small envelope. This is from your mother. Then, without another word, he walked away. Elena stood frozen, staring at the letter in her hands. A part of her wanted to tear it open. A part of her wanted to burn it. But in the end, she did neither. She simply held it close, feeling a storm begin to rise inside her. She wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. Elena sat on the small bed in James's room, staring at the envelope in her hands. She hadn't opened it. James watched her quietly, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. Are you going to read it? Elena bit her lip. I don't know. James sighed and sat beside her. You don't have to decide now, but whatever it says, it doesn't change who you are. Elena turned to him. James, if I told you I had a choice, to go back home and live comfortably or stay here and struggle, what would you say? James's jaw tightened. I'd say, it depends on what makes you happy. Elena looked down. I don't know what makes me happy anymore. James reached for her hand. Then let's figure it out together. Tears stung her eyes, but she nodded. For now she would stay. For now she would hold on. The days passed, but things only got harder. James worked long hours at the mechanic shop, and some days he came home with nothing but tired hands and grease-stained clothes. Elena tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire a poor orphan with no experience. They barely had enough to eat. One night, Elena sat at the small wooden table, staring at the single piece of bread they had left. James noticed and smiled at her. Eat, Elena. She shook her head. You need it more. James sighed and tore the bread in half, handing her a piece. Then we share. Elena took it reluctantly. As they ate in silence, she felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. I hate this, she whispered. I hate struggling. James reached for her hand. I know. Elena looked at him, eyes filled with unshed tears. What if we never make it out of this? James squeezed her fingers. Then at least we have each other. Her heart ached, but she nodded. James had given up everything for her. She would fight for him no matter what. Elena and James walked through the marketplace hand in hand. But as always, the whispers followed them. Look at them, still struggling. She should have found a rich man by now. She's dragging him down. Elena clenched her jaw, trying to block out the words. James noticed and pulled her closer. Ignore them. But then, one of the market women sneered. Hey, James, you're still following that useless girl? She'll bring you nothing but bad luck. James turned sharply. Say that again. The woman smirked. You heard me. A man like you should find someone better. She's nothing. Elena felt her stomach drop. Before she could react, James stepped forward, his voice firm. Don't talk about her like that, the woman scoffed. Why? It's the truth. James's hands clenched into fists. She is everything to me, and I'd rather struggle with her than live in riches with someone like you. The marketplace fell silent. Elena's heart pounded as James grabbed her hand and led her away. When they were alone, she whispered, James, you didn't have to do that. James stopped and looked at her. Yes, I did. She felt tears well up. Why? His voice softened. Because you're worth it, Elena. No matter what they say. A tear slipped down her cheek. James wiped it away. Let them laugh. Let them mock us. It doesn't change what we have. Elena took a shaky breath and nodded. Even in their suffering, their love remained. And that was something no one could take away. Elena and James sat outside their small rented room, watching the stars. The night air was cool, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But deep inside, Elena's heart was restless. She was tired of being mocked, tired of struggling, tired of lying. James had given her everything, his love, his strength, his last penny. And yet she was keeping the biggest secret of all. She wasn't poor. She wasn't an orphan. She was a billionaire heiress. Elena looked at James, his face calm as he stared up at the sky. She wanted to tell him. She needed to tell him. James, she whispered. He turned to her. Yeah? Her throat tightened. I have something to tell you. James frowned slightly. What is it? Elena opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. A familiar voice called her name. She turned sharply, her body going cold. It was the same man who had come before, the man her parents had sent. Miss Elena, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Your father is getting worse. Your mother is begging you to come home. James sat up straight, looking between them in confusion. Elena's heart pounded. James was about to find out the truth, and she wasn't ready. The silence stretched between them. James slowly stood up. Elena, what is he talking about? Elena's hands trembled. James, The man sighed. She is not who you think she is. He turned to James. She is the daughter of one of the richest families in the country. James took a step back, his eyes darkening. What? Elena reached for his hand. James, please. But he pulled away. His face was unreadable. Is it true? He asked, his voice low. Elena felt her chest tighten. Yes. James let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. So, all this time, you lied to me. Tears burned her eyes. I didn't lie. You just what, Elena? His voice broke. You let me believe you were struggling. You let me sacrifice everything for you. Elena's heart shattered. I didn't mean to hurt you. James let out a bitter laugh. Didn't mean to? Do you know what I gave up for you? Do you know what I… His voice caught, and he shook his head. Elena stepped closer. James, I love you. But he took another step back. I need time, he whispered. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And for the first time in a long time, Elena felt truly alone. Elena didn't leave the room for days. She barely ate. She barely slept. The weight of everything pressed down on her. James walking away, the truth being exposed, her father's sickness. She kept replaying the moment James found out, the way his eyes had darkened with hurt and betrayal. She had wanted to tell him. She had tried. But the truth had come out in the worst way possible. And now, he was gone. A knock at the door startled her. For a second, hope flickered in her chest. Maybe it was James. Maybe he had come back. She rushed to the door and yanked it open, only to see the messenger from her family standing there again. Elena, he said softly, it's time to come home. Her hands clenched into fists. I told you. I'm not ready. His face was filled with understanding. Your father doesn't have much time left. Your mother is waiting. Elena looked past him, hoping, praying that James would suddenly appear, that he would tell her not to go, that he still loved her despite everything. But the street was empty. James wasn't coming back, and maybe he never would. Tears burned her eyes. Slowly she nodded. Okay. She would go home. But her heart would stay behind. The mansion looked the same as when she had left it. Grand, untouched, cold. Elena felt like a stranger as she stepped inside. Her mother stood in the hallway, eyes red from crying. The moment she saw Elena, she rushed forward and pulled her into a tight embrace. My child, she sobbed. You're home. Elena stood stiff in her arms, her heart still aching. Home? This place didn't feel like home anymore. She was led to her father's room, where he lay weak and frail in bed. His eyes opened slowly, and when he saw her, a tear rolled down his cheek. Elena, he whispered. You came. Elena swallowed hard and sat beside him. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel anger toward him. Only sadness. I'm here, she whispered back. She held his hand, but even as she sat by his bedside, her mind was somewhere else. She thought of James, of their love, of everything she had lost. And for the first time since coming back, she realized this wasn't where she belonged. Days passed, and her father slowly recovered. But Elena didn't feel whole. She was surrounded by wealth, by comfort, by everything she had once walked away from. And yet, she felt empty. One evening, as she sat alone in the garden, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. James. He stood there, looking the same yet different. His eyes still held pain, but there was something else too. Something softer. Elena, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears welled in her eyes. James. He took a hesitant step forward. I was angry. I felt betrayed, but I realized something. Elena held her breath. James swallowed hard. I love you. And no matter how much I tried to stay away, I couldn't. A sob escaped her lips. He still loved her, despite everything. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have told you sooner. James held her tightly. I don't care about your past. I just want a future with you. Elena pulled back, searching his face. Are you sure? He smiled slightly. I struggled without you. But I don't ever want to struggle for you. We'll build our own life together. No lies, no secrets. Elena nodded, her heart finally at peace. She had found true love, and this time, she wasn't letting go.